Well, hey everybody, how are you doing this week? I'm sitting out on the porch Saturday afternoon. It's kind of hot and muggy and windy and humid, and I'm out here in my stringy hair, and the pollen's getting to me, so I may sneeze some. But I had some thoughts I wanted to share with you today, and hopefully give you a little bit different way of thinking about the lectionary passage for this week. For those of you that use the lectionary passage in your worship, this is in John. It picks up right where we left off last year, and it's the story that is familiar probably to a lot of people because a phrase has come out of it. That phrase is doubting Thomas, and we use that phrase when someone's being a cynic or a skeptic, and it's the story about after Jesus has been resurrected and he appears to the disciples in a room where they're hiding, and they're terrified of the authorities. And you might remember last week I talked about the fact that if anyone was accused of robbing a grave, that was a serious crime. And so perhaps the disciples were worried that the authorities were going to think they had taken Jesus's body, no telling, but they were afraid. And so Jesus appears to them, and he says, "Peace be with you." And he shows them his hands where the nails were, and his wound in his side where he had been pierced. And he breathes into him this breath of spirit, this ruach in Hebrew, that is the Holy Spirit. And so he's commissioning them in this moment to, they're going to carry the spirit of love forward. And so they tell Thomas about it, who for whatever reason, Thomas was not with them. He was one of the disciples, but he wasn't with them. And so he says, unless I see this myself, unless I see his wounds, I'm not going to believe it. And poor old Thomas, he just gets criticized for being skeptical, but who wouldn't be? I mean, even though the first century Mediterranean culture was much more open to the possibility of visions and encounters like this, it's incredulous. So I don't think that it's such a strange thing that he was not just taking his buddy's word for it. So there's another time where they're all together, and Jesus appears to him again, and he says, "Peace be with you." And then he has this moment with Thomas that's so beautiful, and he shows him his wounds, and he said, don't doubt. But it's not like don't ever doubt in your faith. It's sort of like, look, I'm right here, feel of these wounds, and yet here he is resurrected. He has resurrected in his wounds, and Thomas is overwhelmed and believes and moves forward in his life as an ambassador for this love. So this passage gets used a lot of times to chastise us and to remind us that we should just have faith, that we should just believe. But the whole notion of the word that's used for believe is not a mental assent to a set of rules or philosophy or anything like that. This is what are you going to lean on in your life? What are you going to trust? What's going to be the compass for you? And in order for us to get to the place where we really commit to that, we have to go through some doubt. We have to question, and all of the body of Scripture telling us to discern is a theme too, that we aren't to be just people who just take in and don't think for ourselves or wrestle with these things individually. So I would suggest that one of the main things that we might look at in this passage and might take from it is that what Jesus did was show his wounds, his vulnerability, that in the resurrection, Jesus' wounds weren't wiped away, that he was resurrected with his wounds. And that is what he revealed to Thomas. And perhaps one of the things that he was saying to Thomas and to us as well is that God meets us in our wounds. Like, don't believe that because you're broken, or because you're not perfect, or because you have all these flaws, or you have fears, or you even have doubts, that God doesn't meet you in those, and that God doesn't offer you that same beautiful resurrected life. That we live our resurrected life with our wounds, knowing that they are healed through that same power of love that resurrected Christ. One of the things that I did in my early call to ministry was hospital chaplaincy. I did a year-long residency, and I'm sure I've spoken about this probably too many times, but this story reminds me of an experience I had that I'd like to share with you. And I was set to be on call for the hospital for a 24-hour period, and I went to the hospital, and it was on a Sunday, and so I went there at 8 o'clock on Sunday, and I knew there was this young boy that had been in and out of the chronic care unit in the hospital where I was covering, and his whole life, he had lived his whole life in and out of the hospital. He had been born with some physical challenges, and so his whole life had been that. And they had come to the point where his body was weakening and weakening and weakening, and they'd kind of come to the end of the road. And so I knew that he was in the hospital, and that this time he would not be leaving. So I made sure that at every opportunity that I could, in between other calls, that I went and spent with he and his mom. And most of the day it was just his mom was in there. And I'll say that his name was Martin. And Martin was 12, and like I said, his life had been this one of in and out of the hospitals, but his family just loved him so much, and you could tell he had such love for his family as well, and he always had this sweet spirit about him. So I was drawn to them and drawn into this moment. I listened to his mom talk about him and tell the story of his life, and tell the story of his siblings, and tell the story of this one brother who was the only brother that had treated him like a normal kid and would wrestle with him and love on him, but give him a hard time, and what joy that brought Martin. And then I also learned that this illness had been costly for this family, not only financially, but also in relationships. And ultimately, the mother and dad had divorced, and he had remarried and had other children. And all of this pain became really palpable in the early evening when the dad showed up with this additional family, and he came in, and everyone was really quiet, because what was there to say? And Martin's breathing was getting more and more infrequent and shallow, and the dad stood there, and he just looked so hopeless. He loved his son. I'm sure he felt a whole range of emotions, missed opportunities, regret, I don't know, but it was so painful to be in that room in that moment, and yet somehow I felt like that was just where I was supposed to be, but over in the background, nothing to say, just that ministry of presence, no matter how awkward it feels. And everyone was quiet, and we were just listening to this raspy breathing of Martin. And all of a sudden, the door opened, and the light from the hallway, because we had the light kind of dimmed, and then the doorway was just filled with this mountain of a boy. And I knew immediately that this had to be the big brother that had treated Martin completely normal his whole life, and wrestled with him and loved him in such a way that honored his human dignity. And he walked in, he didn't speak to anyone, and you could just see he was in pain, but he just walked over to Martin, and he picked him up. He just scooped him up, because Martin was kind of tall and skinny, but he was just a little fragile thing at this moment. And he picked him up and he walked over to this rocking chair that had been in the room all day and nobody had even thought about it. And he walked over to that rocking chair and he just sat down and he started rocking him. Not saying anything, just rocking him. And from where I was, I could see that Martin was looking up at him with this sweet joy. And he wasn't talking or hardly conscious at this time, but his eyes did open and he looked at his brother and he just, there was just such a sweetness. And the only sound that we could hear in the room then was this rocking chair squeaking a little bit and Martin's breath. It just got slower and slower and slower. Until finally he took his last breath. And then the brother stood up and he carried him back over to the bed and he laid him down on the bed and he put his head in his brother's chest. I'm sorry. Not trying to cry, but it's just still right there. Put his head in his brother's chest and cried like the child that he still was for the first time. And then he got up and he walked out as silently as he had come in. And all of us adults had just stood there helpless. And we all knew that we had experienced something completely holy and transcendent. And I think about this with this passage about Thomas and Jesus showing Thomas his wounds, because while I obviously saw Jesus in the strong compassion and healing embrace of this big brother, the loving extent to which he went, I saw the Christ in Martin's vulnerability and just his complete woundedness in his brother's arm, his complete trust in that love. I think this is the heart of the gospel, is that Christ comes to us in the person of Jesus in all his fragility and vulnerability and woundedness. And then by the power of this Christ power of God, this love that the resurrection comes in that, so that we know no matter what we go through, and no matter what mistakes we make, no matter what flaws we have or fears we get to, no matter what deaths we face, that this love, this Christ power meets us right there. And not only meets us, but is with us in it, is in those actual wounds. And from that comes this power of resurrection, transformation, and new life. So this is not a passage about a mental attitude. This is a passage about understanding that we are loved in it all by a force and a love that understands what pain and brokenness is. That's it.